So let me briefly introduce my colleagues. I was just looking up their formal descriptions, and I'll try not to fumble it. To my furthest down the table is my colleague Siddharth Kara, who is here. He's the director of the program on human trafficking and modern slavery at the Harvard Kennedy School. He has many years of experience in many countries of experience in this field. He's been a partner with the ILO in developing what I would say is the best methodology we've been able to do so far on how to see and how to count where people are in forced labor, on how to understand the indicators of when you have a situation that's heading that way. And so I'm very excited, Siddharth, that you're able to join us. Next to Siddharth is my colleague, Shawna Beidou, who has been, and I just want to thank you, Shawna, you've been instrumental in helping us find the speakers at both this conference and the conference in Washington, and attending both conferences. And as the head of the Solidarity Center, Shawna works with people all around the world on exploitive situations and on combating forced labor and other problems in the labor context. The Solidarity Center is a, I don't know exactly what kind of entity, it's a nonprofit entity of the AFL-CIO. And so it has the full support of the labor movement, and it plays an incredibly important role working with us and internationally as well as in the US. 2 doors down is Hutan. All right, Hamanpur.
Perfect.
Hamanpur. My wonderful colleague from Geneva, who is the number 2 person in our special action program against forced labor around the world. And Hutan has, like my other colleagues, have been asked to really think about how to synthesize what we're learning and how we need to go forward. I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts. And you've met Chris briefly this morning. This is Chris Tilley from UCLA. He welcomed us, and he is the head of the, help me say it right, Institute
for Research on Labor and Employment.
So he's actually an authentic academic expert in addition to having some real expertise in these areas, being from LA. And Chris will help us keep our perspective, I hope, in a different way. And so without further ado, let me just invite you, Siddharth, to kick it off.
Well, hi, good afternoon. Really happy to be here, and thank you, Nancy, for inviting me and including me. In fact, I've got double duty with the ILO. I'm here today and then flying to Geneva tomorrow for some more ILO work in Geneva, so they're going to get their fill of me. Well, this panel is meant to focus on looking forward and sort of synthesizing the day, and I have just a handful of thoughts and remarks on that topic that I'd like to share. But in the first instance, and very much focused on pathways and moving forward, I have a very interesting announcement I'd like to make to all of you that's just very much hot off the presses. This is as of yesterday. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. I know everyone over here is.
Explain it to you.
Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar, let me just give you a brief summary of what this is, and then I've got an interesting announcement I'd like to make, which is very much focused on the path forward. So the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was an act passed in 1930, and a portion of that, Section 307 of the act, banned the import of goods into the United States made by forced or child labor unless there wasn't sufficient production of that good domestically to meet domestic demand. So this quote-unquote consumptive demand carve-out basically rendered that statute or that portion of the Tariff Act meaningless, because if we were importing something, it stands to reason that we weren't making enough of it to begin with. So across the years, this means everything from garments to electronic component minerals to palm oil to steel to lumber to, I mean, anything you can wrap your mind around that you might consume every day was caught by this loophole. Well, lawmakers for many decades have been trying to close this loophole unsuccessfully, and you can imagine why. Corporate lobbying efforts usually stood in the way. Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio recently took on this cause. And I was working with him in his office quite a bit on trying to get this back on the table. And I'm happy to say that as of yesterday, an amendment to the current, I'm going to give you the name of this so you can look it up and Google it and do all the good research that you need to do. The Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015 has an amendment which passed in committee yesterday by a vote of 21-5, sponsored by Senator Brown, that closes the consumptive demand loophole in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. In particular, it calls on monitoring, so the loophole is closed, and three things have to happen. Every year, the number of instances of merchandise that was denied entry pursuant to the act has to be documented, a description of the merchandise, and any other information that may be relevant. So, this is potentially a very interesting game changer. Can you imagine actually enforcing this now and looking at all and sundry of the goods made all around the world that could potentially be tainted by some form of forced labor? And of course, immediately the question is going to be, how are we defining forced labor? But let's put that to the side for a moment. Potentially upending much of the global economy, at least vis-a-vis import into the United States. So this is quite interesting and quite potentially game-changing and paradigm-shifting going forward, which is now the focus of today's panel. So I wanted to share that announcement with you, and I'm really proud of Senator Brown and proud to be a part of his efforts to get this included in legislation, which I think is going to pass very soon. Okay, going forward. I've preoccupied myself for much of the last 15 years with researching various forms of servitude and servile labor exploitation, such as human trafficking and forced labor and child labor, in now more than 40 countries all around the world. And what I can say, I think with some confidence at this point, is I think we're at a turning point. There is an abundance of attention on this issue by governments, by the corporate sector, by civil society, and by everyday citizens that did not exist 5, 10, let alone 15 years ago. There is an abundance of activity that didn't exist many years ago. And I look out in the field and see the potential for significant shifts in how labor is governed and conducted around the world, shifts in how the global economy and its essential underlying logic is unfolding around the world. And I think the issue of forced labor and child labor and the entire spectrum of severe labor exploitation is very much at the forefront of a lot of people's and a lot of important people's minds. But there are still some key gaps that need to be filled that are very, very much at the center of how all of this activity can move forward productively. And some of that has been talked about in the panels earlier today. First and foremost is the research gap. Without question, there is still far too many holes in our knowledge of numbers, metrics, modalities of labor exploitation, the entire spectrum from severe labor exploitation to outright slavery and child servitude. Still, there are severe gaps. The ILO has been doing tremendous work trying to fill some of those gaps, and many researchers have been trying to fill those gaps, but we still have just the scantest sense of really what the scale and scope and functioning of servitude and slavery and child labor are around the world. So the research gap is the big one, and that's where academic institutions, civil society, certainly governments and charitable foundations all have key roles to play. And I think filling that gap is a key activity around more effective efforts, policy, legislative, etc., in tackling these issues. I think another chief gap is engagement with the corporate sector. And this is starting to change. But the issue, and you had the panel earlier today on supply chains, this is now finally starting to take shape. But most of the information out there remains anecdotal or narrative, as opposed to sufficiently driven by data, which gets back to the first gap. But there's enough conversation now that companies are genuinely interested in understanding, many companies, not all, how they can work to clean up their supply chains. And this is going to be an area of significant activity going forward. The next gap, and then I'll wrap up my sort of comments, opening comments anyway. The next gap, I think, in moving forward continues to be transnational cooperation. There are a lot of wonderful organizations that are doing tremendous work locally or regionally. But when it comes to coordinating internationally, whether it's with investigations and prosecutions, whether it's with dealing with victims and survivors, that level of interconnectivity and cooperation simply is severely lacking. On the other side of the ledger, the amount of cooperation and interconnectivity of the traffickers and exploiters transnationally is quite impressive. It's quite sophisticated. And we remain many steps behind them, which is a sad testament to where we are and how much progress needs to be made. So I think forging international relationships at all levels of the key stakeholders, not just governments in the UN level, but civil society, NGOs, as well as charitable foundations that are so much at the heart of promoting research and grassroots efforts to tackle child labor, human trafficking, slavery. That connectivity is a key gap that has to be filled. There remain a lot of things that need to be done around general awareness, which an event like this serves to assist in addressing. But these key areas, I think research, engagement with the corporate sector, and transnational connectivity are really at the forefront of how these issues are going to be tackled more effectively going forward. I'll stop there. I don't want to go over my time and look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the Q&A part. Thank you.
Thank you. Shawna?
Sure.
You've sat through 2 conferences this week.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Shawna Beidou, and I'm the Executive Director of the Solidarity Center, and I'll speak from the perspective of my organization. We work on the ground in 64 countries around the world with worker organizations, migrant rights, activists, trade unions, in order to address the root causes of forced labor and extreme labor exploitation around the world. You know, the last, these 2 days of this conference, there was a lot of very, very fascinating, interesting, and important efforts that were described from the Brazilian and American governments at the local level and national level to tackle forced labor in our 2 countries. And I think, you know, these 2 important democracies in the Americas, these 2 very important economies, the fact that our governments in both places are taking forced labor so seriously is something we should all be proud of in this room. I also think, though, that we need to remember where the real sort of generation of rights doesn't come from governments. Ultimately, governments don't grant rights out of the goodness of their hearts, and employers certainly don't enforce rights, out of their own free will either. The truth is that people, citizens, and in the case of worker rights, drive these changes and create the social change that's needed to generate a consensus in a society that will create these laws and practices, and that it's up to us as citizens, activists, trade unions, and worker activists to continue to push our governments to improve and expand the full range of rights that are needed to be present in a cultural context in order to truly end forced labor. Forced labor doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's created. The possibility for forced labor is created through a lack of presence of law and enforcement, and a lack of understanding in a society about the value and dignity of work. So I think one of the things I really learned over in these two days is a lot from the worker stories that have been told in both conferences. That workers really, the struggle for dignity, even in big economies that are democratic states like the United States and Brazil, are ongoing struggles and challenges that we need to address. So one thing I would say is a concrete recommendation to our government and employer colleagues who have participated in these conferences is to say that we need to throw down as societies on expanding the full range of rights for all workers in our societies if we really, really want to tackle forced labor. And that means proactively supporting amendments to laws that will expand freedom of association and a collective bargaining for workers, that will expand the amount of rights that were given to all citizens regardless, or all people in a country regardless of national origin. We heard a lot about exploitation of migrants. I think we need to see far more proactive efforts on the part of both employers and governments to actively expand these bodies of rights if we really want to tackle forced labor. Because the truth is we're leaving way too many tools on the table. In the previous panel, someone asked a question about trade and trade arrangements. Currently there's discussion in the US context of expanding trade across the Pacific. And in the countries in negotiation with the United States, there are several of them that have exploitative labor practices, including forced labor and human trafficking, including some countries that are listed in the United States Trafficking in Persons Report as being having a high prevalence of the worst forms of human trafficking, including being listed as a tier 3 ranked country for human trafficking. And yet, instead of engaging countries first in this trade dialogue about how do we end forced labor first before we expand, we're leaving that tool on the table and we're starting the negotiations and we say we'll deal with it afterwards. I think that's a tool we shouldn't be leaving on the table if we really want to eradicate forced labor. I also think I would second what my colleague said earlier about the global system. So, when you look at supply chains, there really truly is no global governance of global supply chains. There's no corporate governance that is global of supply chains. And when you look at trade arrangements, whether coming out of the EU or across Africa, across the Asian Pacific, and from the United States, actually most of what these trade arrangements do is loosen regulation on supply chains and investment and business regulation. So we're not necessarily moving in a direction of more regulation. We sometimes are taking a step back on a global level. So I think a real recommendation needs to be to look at, if we really want to eliminate forced labor in supply chains, there has to be global governance of supply chains. And that's got to come from somewhere. It's got to come from the United Nations system, and it's got to come from governments working together to create that with employers. I also think the same is true about migration. Many of the solutions we've discussed in these 2 days of conference have been, migration we tend to look at as from a country-based situation. There's, Bolivians working in Brazil, so what are the Brazilian laws and practices that protect or don't Brazilian workers from exploitation? There are Latin American and Asian immigrants in the United States that are working in the United States. What are the laws and practices of the United States that do or do not protect the rights of these workers? Well, the truth is these are global migration systems, and you can't really solve these problems on a country-by-country basis. So the extent to which forced labor, migration is on the spectrum making workers more vulnerable to forced labor, we really need to have systems of governance of the global migration system that look at both ends of the spectrum. So I can tell you I worked in the Gulf state of Qatar and have spent a good deal of time in Bahrain. And just as an example, other than the United States, the Gulf countries are the second biggest receiving region for global migration, for work. And the presence of exploitation is extremely high. When you talk to an embassy of Nepal and an embassy of Bangladesh in any one of the Gulf countries, and you ask about conditions of work for workers from their countries in those Gulf countries, they will say, they're bad. I mean, you walk into an embassy of Nepal in Doha, Qatar, and what you see is 150 workers who haven't been paid for weeks on end, clamoring to get the attention of the embassy to help them solve and get their back wages. This is an endemic problem of forced labor in the Gulf. But the truth is, for too long, the global migration system has treated migration truly and only as a positive development tool. So I'm a poor country, I'm Nepal. 30% of my GDP comes from remittances. Remittances are really important. We can't generate the jobs at home, so it's better that workers migrate. This is good for Nepali development. And then on the Gulf side, the Qataris say, we don't have a lot of workers, we're building our country, it's good for our development that we import workers. Well, the truth is, on both sides of that, there's no incentive, not on the Nepali government side or the Qatari government side, to raise standards for workers. If you're the Nepali government, what you hear is, if we raise wages for our workers in Qatar, the Qataris are just gonna go get Burmese workers, or they're just gonna go get a cheaper source of labor. And so there's a competition on the, quote, sending side to keep wages down. The incentive is not to raise wages. And so I think, you can't really solve the problem of forced labor in Qatar in a vacuum, absent understanding that system. And so I think we need approaches that bring governments together around the common story of how are we going to, yes, treat migration as a positive development tool, but from a rights-based perspective with a high standard and a goal in the end of raising the floor for everybody and not having a race to the bottom that leads to forced labor and the commodification of labor. These are some of the root causes of some of the worst forms of forced labor we see. I'd also say, I'd put a call out to the governments of Brazil and the United States. I can be critical of all of our practices. On the other hand, we have such good examples at the local and state level and national level in both countries of trying at the governmental level to combat forced labor. Some of the best examples coming out of governments in the world are coming out of the United States and Brazil. So I would give a call to the governments of the United States and Brazil as a concrete follow-up to this conference to convene a bigger conference of nations that have not generated the kinds of laws and practices that we have in both these two countries, and help give advice and support to those other nations to improve their laws. So I would call on our governments to do that as a positive form of cooperation. And I think there's a lot more to say, but I'll just leave it at that for now and come back to a couple other examples later of what else I think we can do.
Thank you, Shawna. Ready, Hutan? And please say a little more about your role in ILO, because I haven't given anyone justice that way.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you all for being here. My name is Hutan Homayunpur, and I work for the ILO Special Action Program combating forced labor based in Geneva, Switzerland, and I work on employers' engagement. I do donors relations, fundraising, I design projects. I also backstop projects in Brazil and Peru, as well as a sub-regional project based out of Bangkok. Those are the many hats I wear. I wanted to start by saying that we at the ILO estimate that today there are about 21 million slaves around the world. We at the ILO estimate that annually $150 billion are made on the back of these workers. And of course everyone agrees with us because we're the ILO, right? Right? Okay, I need to be honest. No, not everyone agrees, but at least it's clear, and it's ever more clear after these 2 days of conferences that we've had, that we all agree there is a problem. And we all agree that there's a role for everyone to play. Workers, employers, governments, NGOs, activists, consumers, everyone and anyone. Okay, so these are the things that we can agree on. Now, we've also heard about some fantastic initiatives that have been going on in Brazil and the United States and elsewhere. We've heard of fantastic laws, policies, initiatives, and it's been great. We also heard today that if the right structure is not in place, no matter how hard we try, we will not win this battle. The governments have the responsibility to protect, okay, after all. And that is very important, and we should not forget that, because the Brazilian mobile inspectors, if the right structure was not put in place by the government, then they wouldn't have the success that they have today, okay? Another thing that has become very clear for me, and that I'm very happy about, initially when I started to work in this area 7 years ago, I went to see different governments, and they basically said, listen, why are you here? I said, well, I want to discuss forced labor. And they said, well, you're in the wrong place, because forced labor does not exist in our country. You should go there. Okay. I go to the workers, and the workers say, yeah, it's fantastic. We're ready to support and do anything you want. Okay, I go to the employers and some companies, and they say, we're afraid of engaging with you. I said, why? Do I look that scary? I mean, come on, I'm a nice guy. They said, no, because if we engage, then everyone assumes that we basically are admitting that we have a problem. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, that's not true at all. We've moved away from that. Governments all admit today, with the exception of a few, that they have a problem. Okay? Employers are ever more engaged than any other time in history in this battle. They're genuinely interested. We can always say there are exceptions in governments, workers, and employers. I mean, they all have their own agendas. There are always exceptions. But from my conversations, I can tell you, they're all genuinely in this. And I mean, why wouldn't be? You know, because I truly believe that there is enough money around the world to be made that people do not have to use slave labor to make more money, right? Okay, so that's the basis of our discussions. Another fantastic thing that I've seen in the past 2 days, especially in the US, and I've learned today and in Washington, D.C. 2 days ago that we had this conference, was that we have moved away from the same old speech of it's all about sex trafficking, it's all about sex slavery. It's very important, but that's not where the biggest problem is. It's trafficking for forced labor. Okay? That's also been great to see. Another issue that I'm very happy, because I absolutely hate these discussions. They're important, but I hate them, is definitions. Every time I was in the States, first question was, well, what is the ILO's official, how do you define this? How do you define that? And we got stuck on this issue for many years, and a lot of more victims fell into the traps of slavery and forced labor and trafficking. So that's also been a great, great change that I can observe in the past 2 days. Another thing that I want to say and compliment Siddharth, and I'll finish with that, is I would love to be able to sit here and tell you that we have made great progress and impact. Okay? But I'm much more honest than that, unfortunately. I can tell you that we hope we have made a great impact and that we are making a difference. But we don't have the baseline data to tell you. We absolutely don't. And anyone that sits here and tells you that we can prove to you that we've been successful is bullshitting you. Excuse the term. Okay? So we need to push for more surveys to be done in countries, for better data to be collected in order to be able to have that honest, humble discussion with ourselves. Are we doing the right thing? Have our laws worked? Have our policies worked? Have our projects at the ILO worked? Okay, I'm sure they have. It's the laws that don't work. But anyway, so those are the discussions that we really need to have and we need to have more of. Thanks.
Thank you, Hutan. Chris, do share about the Institute for a moment, if you will.
Well, I'm going to say a word about the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment here at UCLA, which I direct. We are a think and do tank, so both pieces are here in this conference. Both are part of what we do. We do research, we do education, we also do outreach and work with policymakers, unions, immigrant rights organizations, anybody who's trying to make work better in California and around the world. And we're increasingly moving in a global direction for some of the reasons that all the panelists, including Shawna, have touched on about the global nature of labor issues. So good afternoon, boa tarde. I want to try to build on the three panels, add some of my own ideas, and I want to make 5 points. The first one is ILO conventions are great, labor standards laws are great, corporate codes of conduct are great, but monitoring and enforcement is key. What's on paper is important and basic, but if it doesn't get enforced, it doesn't make any difference. An important new direction is greater involvement of worker organizations as well as other kinds of civil society organizations in monitoring and even in enforcement in a variety of situations. Another thing we've heard about today to some extent is the importance of putting responsibility on third parties in supply chains in various ways and holding them responsible as well. Yet another that we haven't heard as much about but is worth emphasizing is imposing and enforcing penalties on employer retaliation, which is a serious problem in suppressing workers' ability to make complaints and to pursue them. A second point is that although global supply chain accountability is crucial, the majority of workers in the world and the majority of forced labor in the world actually takes place in service industries, in production industries that have domestic markets. Think about domestic work, think about construction. Small farms were mentioned earlier today. There's a whole set of jobs that are not necessarily subject to global supply chain pressure, and we have to think about how to address those too. That's got to be part of our mandate. Third point, I want to agree with Shawna Beidou and with Abel Valenzuela and Maria Elena Durazo from the last panel in emphasizing the importance of migration and the intertwining of migration with labor exploitation, including extreme forms of labor exploitation. We know from the headlines there's a crisis going on right now in Europe. I would argue there's still a crisis in the United States. There's a crisis in South Africa. From some of the things that Max Tunyon was saying, it sounds like there are elements of a crisis in Malaysia. There's probably a lot of places we're not hearing as much about. These two issues are tightly wound together. It's important to think about expanding migrant rights, empowering migrants in various ways to claim a broader set of labor rights, regulating recruiters, as the state of California is doing, foreign labor recruiters, and finding ways to intermesh these two issues. Third point, and here again, I'm echoing some of the people in the last panel as well as Shawna. It's important to find new, better, and broader ways to organize workers, especially the most informal and precarious workers. In our research at the Institute, we've seen the greatest strides in improving labor standards when worker organizations work hand in hand with NGOs, with governments, in some cases with employer associations as well. And if you don't have that partner of organized workers, it's a lot harder to get things done. The fourth point is to say that enforcement is basic, but there's also many situations in which what's needed is finding ways to upgrade the sector so that businesses can actually afford to pay workers more because they're finding ways to be more productive, to sell to new markets, to not just make money by selling at the bottom of the market and trying to be as cheap as possible. Brazil has really been a leader in this approach to upgrading. Some of the tools have been redefining the skills and duties of inspectors, and also the very Brazilian concept of social dialogue that brings together all the stakeholders to think about how to upgrade a sector, move a region forward economically and socially. And I think we should be learning from Brazil, but we should also be learning from Patagonia, which is, in working with its suppliers, is trying to stimulate a similar process. Final point, and this is echoing pretty much anybody who's spoken today, is just to say that this is a global issue, it's a global system, it's a global labor market, and there's a great need for dialogue across countries, across regions, definitely across sectors. So between labor and government and nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and employers who are ready to engage in that discussion. That can't just be dialogue, but has to move on to collaborative research and collaboration around developing policies and strategies. So that's what I think today has been about. I really want to salute the 4 sponsors who made this happen. And I think it's encouraging how far we've come, but when you think about the scale of the problem that was laid out at the beginning of the day, we're really just getting started. And so I hope that everybody in this room is also going to take this as a charge to find ways to advance this dialogue and collaboration themselves.
Thank you, Chris. If you allow me, I'm going to take a couple minutes to respond to our panelists, and I'm going to ask you all to respond to each other, at least to see what that has stimulated, and then open it up for a discussion. Those of you who are in Washington heard me say this, but I've worked around these issues for about 15 years, some of it not inside ILO. And when I first was part of it, there was this guy named Roger Plant. I don't know if anybody remembers him, but he was the guy at ILO who helped establish that program and was a voice working with countries that would never work with places like the US or others to address this. But at that time, I felt that I was watching these green islands that were jewels in a huge ocean, where a few projects were really making a difference, and the rest of the ocean was an ocean of exploitation. And I thought, are there any systems, are there any larger discussions or structures we could be using? And of course, at ILO, we have a structure of international labor standards and the core labor standards, which include freedom of association, collective bargaining, the end of child labor, the end of forced labor, and discrimination. Those are the core labor standards that around the world countries have committed to move forward on. And yet, of course, you're right, if we're not working on it, if we're not implementing it, then it is at best our defined standards. But we are working on it, and Siddharth, it was so interesting to me that you decided to frame this in the terms of gaps, because in this 15 years, which is a long time and a short time, for me, what I have seen and why I envisioned these conferences with my partners is because I feel like we're getting a lot closer. We have 2/3 of the countries almost have passed laws against forced labor or forms of labor exploitation, and it's run like wildfire in some ways with a lot of hard work across the world. And there are implementation structures, government structures that work on this, in some places better than others. In that time, I feel like the network of work and the network of learning around this is almost to the point where instead of we're talking about great best practices in a few places in the world, we can begin to talk about gaps. That blows my mind, okay? That we're talking about gaps. And it was a little funny in Washington when we discussed this 2 days ago. There were actually some people who said, well, now we're kind of getting to the geeky parts of this. You know, what is the better technique? What's the better strategy? Why is it? And that's true. But of course, there are big gaps. We've learned that Not only are the supply chains a critical place to work, but not the only place, but so are the migration corridors. And when you start to look at these together, we have a bigger picture of what's at stake. So I'm very hopeful in the sense that when I think about how change happens, and there are many theories of change, but in this case, it is something wondrous to me that there is a role for everyone, as we just said, that every local person that's working on a local issue is contributing to this bigger net, and that it bothers us all, I think, that we're not going to be there for every worker very soon who is in an exploitive situation. But because of the potential connectedness of our work, we have an exponential possibility to make a big change together, and not in a completely coordinated way, to keep that change rolling. And that includes everybody, and we tried to acknowledge that today with many corporate partners and many labor partners and governments. And so the work is not done, and there's plenty of partners who have been disappointing and then been surprising. I mean, it changes. So I just turn to you, my colleagues, and say, I invite you to dig deeper one more time in any way you want to, because I do trust you're thinking about this, and I really would love to hear the feedback and the thoughts that have risen in our audience. So do you want to go back the same way, Siddharth?
Sure, let's do that. It's a very rich conversation. I enjoyed listening to the comments of my fellow panelists, and a few thoughts occurred to me, and I just wanted to share those in follow-up to this conversation. One important point I want to make: I've had occasion across the last many years to sit down face-to-face, speak with and document the cases of several thousand individuals in various modes of servitude and bondage and servile labor exploitation, spanning some of the most extreme and atrocious cases you could imagine in your worst nightmares, all the way across the gradient to just poor working conditions and underpaid wages. And at the same time, I've found myself often in conferences or meetings with government officials or in UN convenings and whatnot, and what has always struck me and continues to strike me is that these two populations very rarely communicate with each other. And what I mean by that is the voice of the individuals we're ostensibly attempting to benefit is very often not at the table. And I just want to make sure, and this is back to the gap discussion, if that's my thesis for the day, it is so crucial for the voice of that victim or survivor to be front and center to any and all efforts and theorizing and tactical discussions, let alone actual interventions, to remedy their condition. Very often the things we theorize and think they need are not at all what they need, are not at all what they hope for and wish to have. I'll give you one simple example. I was in a village in India not too long ago, and the World Bank had come through recently, and several major foundations, Gates, Ford, whatnot, and they'd come, there's a lot of attention in rural India, and they had come and talked about microcredit and self-help savings groups and whatnot as the key things that were needed here to help alleviate vulnerability to human trafficking and bonded labor and whatnot. And I went to some of these same villages during the course of my research, and I sat down and I was speaking mostly with the women in these villages, and they had told me all about these meetings and what the recommendations were for what they needed. And I said, well, what do you think? What do you really need today? And every single one of these young women said, I just want a toilet. I want a place to go and do my business privately with some dignity. And then the rest of that can follow, because it's the indignity of going into a field where there might be purveying eyes and leering eyes that oppresses them and shames them and brings indignity to their life. And from all of that follows their own lack of sense of self-worth that makes them vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking and keeps them oppressed and suppressed and unable to put a foot on the ladder of economic development and upliftment. So let their voices be at the center of the things we think about, is one thing I wanted to make sure I shared. One of the things I tell my students is sort of a key thesis that's born out of my research. And now this is going from the minutia of the village to the 30,000 foot level. And a key thesis that's emerged from my research is that all of what we're talking about, the pervasiveness and immensity of human trafficking and labor exploitation, is fundamentally driven by the ability of the exploiter to generate these substantial profits that the ILO has calculated at almost no real risk through the exploitation of a global subclass of disenfranchised, impoverished individuals. These are minorities, these are outcast groups, subclasses that aren't participating in humanity as you and I understand it. And that renders them ever vulnerable. And when there's no real risk, and this comes to the point that was made, which is why it was put in my mind that Professor Tilley made, there's what's on paper and there's what's actually enforced. And these are often worlds apart. So when there's no real risk to the offender and the exploiter, they generate these profits, and the crime of trafficking and child labor and labor exploitation and shadow labor markets persists. That thesis has to be inverted. And I realize that's the 30,000 foot view, but there has to be substantial risk and cost introduced into the system of servile labor exploitation, simultaneous with the upliftment and normalization of this subclass of human beings around the world. And what does that actually mean? Well, this is what we have to figure out from a tactical standpoint on both the supply and demand side of slave labor and human trafficking around the world. I think there's space for much new leadership in this field. There's tremendous opportunity for new leaders, thought leaders, action leaders, leaders of all kinds in this field. And I want to make sure everyone here knows that and is thinking about that and dwelling on that. And what is your space and your place as a new leader in this field? Mm-hmm. Finally, at the risk of upsetting Hutan, I think we still have to work through some of these definitional things. There's so much frustration out there, and we often find ourselves in these conferences devolving into these debates about slavery versus forced labor versus human trafficking, and where are the lines between this and that. And on the one hand, it doesn't really matter, because if you see exploitation, you recognize it, and you know something needs to be done. But on the other hand, the law requires precision. And prosecutors and judges don't know how to deal with an offense if it's not precisely defined. The flip side of that is defense attorneys know how to evade culpability where there isn't precision in the law. And this is kind of what we see at the local court level and the international court level. This lack of precision of definitions and clarity is allowing criminality to persist. So some of this work around definitions has made progress. There's still some work to be done, and as tedious as it might be, I think that's a very important facet of what needs to happen going forward. So I'll stop there, because I can just prattle on and on and on about my thoughts and 2 cents worth on this topic, but everyone else has equally rich thoughts to share, I'm sure. So thank you.
And I'll just
Still
say
hurt.
5 minutes, 3 minutes each, if that's okay. No? Shawna?
Yeah.
You want to go next, Hutan?
Sure. I absolutely agree, unfortunately, that we need to have that discussion and more of a precision on the definitions. What I really wanted to say is I hate to be part of that, but it's part of my job. What I wanted to say is also we need to be mindful of the fact that there is no quick fix to this problem. We've had this problem for centuries. We can now argue that the forms have changed, and that the systems used are different, and the crimes are somewhat different. But this problem has existed for centuries, and we're not going to get rid of it overnight. Why do I think that's important to point out? Because as much as there is room for new leaders, new thinkers, new people to get involved. We should also be conscious of the fact that there are many more actors than ever before combating this. There are more NGOs, work organizations, employers getting involved, governments, and it's getting crowded and more crowded. But a lot of people are looking for the quick fix. Donors are putting demands on international organizations such as ILO, NGOs that they fund. They want to see impact immediately within the next 12 to 24 months, which is, I can tell you, impossible. We can meet your demands and say, yes, we will save 180,000, women and men and children and rescue them and make sure that they're integrated in the formal economy and schooling. But so what? What is the sustainable impact that we want to achieve? And that's one thing that we need to be, conscious of, because through our research, we've seen that any meaningful impact is only gained if we have a project that has a minimum life of 5 years. It's the reality of it, okay, on average. And that's important to remember. Progress is slow, and we want sustainable impact.
One thing this question of, I had mentioned and others have mentioned the lack of, regulation of the global economy essentially and global supply chains. Today's the anniversary of the Rana Plaza tragedy, as people have mentioned earlier. And after that tragedy, there's more attention than there ever has been, in recent years, headline news all over the world about the need for accountability in supply chains, essentially. They didn't put that word in there, but they said, what's the role of the brands? Are the brands accountable or not? Was it, can H&M and The Gap and all these brands be held liable or accountable for what happened in that building, and all these debates? Out of that came a couple really interesting developments that are still experimental and interesting to learn lessons of. One thing was there are two different agreements that came from different collaborations of global brands in the garment industry that created their own responses to the Bangladesh tragedy and directly trying to address building and fire safety. There's one that's known as the Accord, another one that's known as the Alliance. We could talk about the difference if you'd like, but the Accord was essentially negotiated with in a global labor framework, and the ILO has engaged both. In any event, so there was an attempt at a more stringent, stricter sort of corporate accountability model with the Accord that had some good progress. Global brands agreed to put money into a fund that would help reconstruct buildings that were shoddily developed in Bangladesh to improve them around fire safety, and several other aspects of that particular agreement, which are very interesting. But 2 years later, the other story that has come out that has made news like I haven't seen it before, including from the New York Times to International Business Times to The Guardian to several papers across the world, is the fact that the workers that went into that building that day when it collapsed on them had known that the building was unsafe. They had seen cracks in the building, and they in some cases asked to not have to go in there, and they were told, if you don't go in to this building today, you're going to lose a month of pay. And for low-wage workers, you can't do that with a family that depends on you. And that building collapsed on their heads, and they died by the hundreds in that building. And so out of the story, one of the additional remedies beyond just this kind of brand accountability question was the notion of workers having the right to have a say in their own wages and working conditions, and to be able to fundamentally reject unsafe work, which is an innovation of the global labor movement around the world, 100 years of struggle to get to this question of, do I have to work in an unsafe, undignified work setting or not? And the solution that was given to this question, and it has come up in the Bangladesh context, is that workers need voice and representation in order to be able to say, no, I'm not going to that building, you can't make me, and you can't fire me for saying that. That's what part of the solution that's been discussed has been the workers need unions in these factories. So over the last 2 years, Bangladeshi workers, and we have a robust program there, we support 60 union organizers on the ground with trade unions in factories in the garment industry. They have expanded coverage of trade union representation in the factories. But what's happening is not a happy, joyous response on the part of global brands and the government and the local business owners, but rather a massive pushback and retaliation against these workers. So 2 years after the Rana Plaza tragedy, what we see is an increase of retaliation against workers by employers who send local thugs to beat up union activists in the factories, and by government that is rejecting union registration requests at a rate twice as high in 2015 as they did in 2013. So the truth is, when we talk about expansion of rights in order to make sure that we are really seeing progress to end abusive, extreme labor exploitation, the truth is governments and employers need to do the hard thing on that, which is to expand rights and protections for workers. And the truth is that doesn't happen enough. More what we get is really intense pushback. So some of the work, I agree with Siddharth, that listening to the workers directly, governments and employers need to sit down and hear directly from workers, particularly at the end of the supply chain, about what their actual day-to-day experience is, and develop and create policy responses that directly respond to what they say their conditions are. And one tool we know we have in the global economy from 100 years of expansion of human rights is freedom of association and collective bargaining as one really important way to create worker voice. So the question is, will the employer community and the governments around the world actively support an extension of these rights or not? Will we do the hard thing or not? I would say if we want to end forced labor, we got to do the hard thing and do that.
Shawna commented earlier in this panel that on some of these issues, Brazil and the United States are actually in the lead globally. So I wanted to say, well, why is it that these two countries, which are quite different from each other in many ways, are in the lead? And I wanted to call out particularly coalitions, creativity, and commitment. Coalitions meaning finding ways for labor unions to work with other kinds of work organizations, to work with NGOs, to work with government agencies at local, regional, and national levels, to work with employer associations and individual employers. Lots of different actors working together. Creativity, simply coming up with new ways to solve this problem, new ways to get workers to the table, as Shawna is saying. To some extent, necessity is the mother of invention. Brazil came out of a dictatorship where people were organizing in new ways, in some ways because they have had to. In the United States, the numerical strength of unions has diminished greatly, but what that means is that unions and their allies have come up with new ways and new approaches that perhaps in other countries have not been as readily tried. But the third, and again, the bottom line is commitment. If you do not have governments that are prepared to deal with this, and if you don't have citizens holding those governments accountable, if you don't have, for that matter, even trade unions that are interested in reaching out to workers that may be beyond their current membership, but that are undercutting their current membership in various ways. So you've got to have the commitment of those actors. Employers is obviously a hard one. Not every employer is going to be Patagonia. And so, but I think that it's not necessarily a formula you can easily duplicate or bottle, but this combination of coalitions, creativity, and commitment is what we need to be building around the world.